Welcome, everyone. So good to see you. If you have a cell phone which is not on mute, this would be a good time to put it on mute. Or even better, as a practice of what life used to be like in the early aughts, when we concentrated and paid attention to each other, we could turn it off. My name is William Edelglass, and I was one of the folks, along with several others of you in the room, who, in this very space at 118 Elliott, in January of 2017, we were gathered by Lissa Weinman to put together a grant proposal to the National Endowment for the Humanities. They were offering funds for projects that use the humanities to build community. And there were 5 organizations in Brattleboro: the Brooks Memorial Library, the Brattleboro Historical Society, the Write Action, which is a group of local writers, Marlboro College. Was that 5? And the Brattleboro Literary Festival. Thank you, Mary. And we explored possible ideas and realized that in the process of building community through the humanities, what we wanted to do in part was explore our community and explore our place, explore the words that were written, that were interpreted from nature, from publishing, from diaries, from advertisements, the words that have given meaning to the lives of many different people in this community. It was a project that wanted to build community by inviting as many people who were interested into the project. So we ended up having many school children, retired folks, teachers, people involved in those organizations, people who became excited about particular historical figures in particular places in the Brattleboro area. And what arose was a kind of mapping of this area, a mapping of the history, an audio mapping that allowed for all kinds of different ways of thinking about this place that we share, and the many people who have lived and made meaning here from time immemorial to very recent. So one way of thinking about such a project is as a deep mapping project, a project that involves audio and unpacking particular places in multiple ways, that there's no one univocal, no one monolithic, no one view that simply determines what the story is or what the experience was, but there are many, many perspectives and many stories. So a view that ideally makes space for others, makes space for different people to tell their stories. A view that has pictures, video, audio, maps, images, words, written words, and all of that lives on the Brattleboro Words Project website, and also much of it lives on the Brattleboro Words Project app. The place where I started studying deep mapping in particular was actually a course at Marlboro College that I taught as part of this project, and I co-taught it with my comrade here, Christopher Lamb. He and I co-taught that the year after he graduated from Marlboro, and it was called Philosophy of Place and Public Scholarship. And the idea was to look at a bunch of different perspectives on what place is, and how to think about place, and how to represent place, and how to explore place from multiple perspectives in the humanities. And then how to engage from a humanities perspective as a public intellectual, and to do some work that could be shared with the public. And the very first audio that was produced, edited with great skill by Reg Martel, was an audio that Chris Lamb put together about the Harris Hill ski jump. For those of you who don't know, Christopher Lamb, he's mainly a scholar, and on the side he's a world-class ski jumper, and won a number of Harris Hill competitions. And so we opened the Brattleboro Words Trail with this audio presentation by Chris at the Harris Hill ski jump in 2019, 2018, somewhere in there. 2019. And for those of you who want to learn what it's like to ski jump, to just fly off the hill, I recommend that you go to the website or go to the app and you can listen to Chris, that amazing audio clip. So, as you can see, Chris Lamb has been part of this project from very early on and has thought deeply and seriously about it in the context of thinking about place. But he also, in his graduate work, has taken up this question of deep mapping and what that might mean, how one might engage a place in a very, very deep way from multiple perspectives. And Chris is going to tell us a little bit about his deep mapping project in Idaho. I imagine that, I hope, some of you will have questions at the end of Chris's presentation. For me personally, I know if I try to think of 3 questions, if I'm in a presentation, if I try to think of 3 questions to ask at the end, I tend to pay better attention. So I would invite each of you, especially those who are in the room and may be called on at the end, to think of questions that you can ask Chris at the end. And for those of you who are on Zoom, we are so glad that you are here. And what you can do is put a question in the chat, and Maisie will then read your question, and Chris will be able to respond. And if you have any technical questions, for those of you who are listening from the comfort of your homes, you can put them in the chat as well. Okay. It is with great pleasure that I introduce tonight's speaker, my colleague, my friend. And one of the great things that can happen for a teacher is when your student knows a lot more about something than you ever did. So I can say my teacher also. Thank you, Chris.
So I'm assuming, is this on for me? So thanks, William. It's great to be here and to have the opportunity to share a little bit about this project that I've been working on, this collaborative deep mapping project in Idaho with my colleague, Jack Cradell, who's a fellow grad student out there in coordination with the Center for Digital Inquiry and Learning at the library at the university. And that's mainly what I'm going to talk about tonight. But before I get into kind of the details of the recent mapping, the recent extirpation, and the absence of mountain caribou in the South Selkirk Mountains of North Idaho, I want to talk a little bit about, I think William did a good job of describing the deep map conceptually and kind of the theory behind the project, which is very similar, I think, conceptually to the Brattleboro Words project. Interestingly enough, the last time that I was here at 118 Elliott was just before William and I had co-taught this class up in Marlboro on philosophies of place and space, and I had just finished my undergraduate work up there on philosophies of place. And William invited me to come down here for a talk about the Words project. And I remember sitting in this room and hearing the ideas, the desires, the aspirations for that project, and being relieved and excited that the crazy philosophy that I was working on with William up at Marlboro actually had not only an application in the real world, but one just down the street from where I was going to school, and a project that I find really meaningful and important. So anyway, so as William said, we taught this class that fall up at Marlboro in coordination with the Words project. And there were a couple of readings that we did that I can trace my work back to, that I can trace some threads back to from this current deep mapping project that I've been working on out in Idaho. And one of those readings was by a feminist geographer by the name of Doreen Massey, who William and I read together, who presents a really fascinating critique of our traditional Western-style maps. And what Massey points out is that our usual notion of maps, the way that they kind of represent space, help to pacify and take the life out of the way that we typically think of space. One of the things that they do is they remove the lived experience of a space, the phenomenological experience of a space, the storied component of the space. That's something that is very important to the Words Project here. And the experience of looking at a map like this, scientific rendering of the geographical space of Alaska, is that the observer is always outside and above the object of representation. And so it's not an experience of a map that is inviting, that is participatory, that asks the user to be a part of the space and think deeply about what it means to engage with and be of a certain place. And so Massey wants to think about space as a simultaneity of stories, a simultaneity of ongoing, unfinished, interconnecting and disconnecting stories. And the deep map is in large part a response to this critique, which isn't just Massey's critique, it's a common critique among critical geographers, that maps, these traditional Western style maps or any two-dimensional map is limited in the way that it represents a particular space. It presents one way of seeing space, one experience, and one kind of idea of what space is. And this isn't necessarily a deep map, but this other map of Alaska gives you a sense of what it might be like to go beneath the surface of what Massey is critiquing in these traditional maps, and to look at a place as kind of a storied landscape, a space of intersubjective experiences, a space that has many different histories. And this is not, as I said, it's not necessarily a deep map in the way that deep maps are interactive and open-ended, but it gives you a sense of what it might be like to start to go beneath the surface. But I think this quote by from another reading that we did in this public scholarship class gives a good example of what a deep map is and what a deep map is trying to accomplish. And they say that a deep map is a finely detailed multimedia depiction of a place and the people, animals, and objects that exist within and are thus inseparable from the contours and rhythms of everyday life. Deep maps are not confined to the tangible or material, but include the discursive and the ideological dimensions of a space. The dreams, hopes, and fears of residents, they are in short positioned between matter and meaning. So again, going beyond the mere representation of the physical, geographical space and trying to give a sense of what it's like, what are the affective dimensions of that space? What is it like to live through that space and to be a part of that space? And one of the things that I've been thinking a lot more about and find very compelling through the process of being a part of these, I'm involved in multiple deep mapping projects now. This is the one that is coming to completion. Is thinking of deep mapping as so much more than an attempt at representing a space. It's actually also a practice that as this quote from Les Roberts, who is a scholar of deep mapping, describes very well that very little of what deep mappers are doing is in fact oriented towards the production of maps, so much as immersing themselves in the warp and weft of a lived and fundamentally intersubjective spatiality. Deep mapping can be looked upon as an embodied and reflexive immersion in a life that has lived and performed spatially a cartography of depth, a diving within. So anybody who's involved in the Brattleboro Words Project, I think, might get a sense of what the deep map is doing on a larger scale if you've participated in the Words Trail or gone to the website or been kind of participating in the project since the beginning, that so much of what the deep map is also your interactions with people behind the scenes, your making connections with people who have experiences that they want to share from their life lived in Brattleboro. It's going out there and engaging and gaining. I like to think of it not so much as a representation, but an orientation, a practice of orienting oneself to a particular place. So going beyond the map as an isolated, finished kind of representation of a place, to think of it as something that's practiced, that we're all taking part in, and that gives us a sense of ourselves as participants in the spaces within which we live and move through on a day-to-day basis. So we're not, this is kind of the leap that Massey, I think, as I talked about earlier, is encouraging, one that invites people into the map to recognize the way in which we are creators of the spaces that we live in. So that's basically the more or less the conceptual framework that we've been working with this project. I think it ties the Words Project and this Caribou Storying Extinction project together nicely. And now I'll introduce the mountain caribou. This is a South Selkirk mountain caribou. It's a mountain caribou. So the mountain caribou, South Selkirk, and that's a mountain range in North Idaho and southern BC. And the South Selkirk mountain caribou is a subspecies of the woodland caribou, and they're unique in that, unlike barren ground caribou of Alaska, the caribou that I think we tend to think about when we think of caribou, that travel in large herds and cover long distances in the tundra in Alaska, the mountain caribou evolved to migrate vertically up to the ridges, the high alpine ridges in the mountains of southern BC, in northern Idaho, in eastern Washington. They live on ridges like this in the wintertime. So in the fall, they live at about 4,000, 5,000 feet in the cedar hemlock bottoms underneath the dense canopy, until the snow piles high and dense enough for them to reach to climb onto the ridge lines and reach the arboreal lichens that grow on the old growth subalpine spruce and Engelmann fir trees. And that's what they subsist off of throughout the winter, exclusively these lichens. And this was largely a predator avoidance strategy, living up on the ridge line. Predators such as wolves and mountain lions had a harder time getting to them because the snow is so deep. And the caribou developed over time, they evolved to have these snowshoe-like hooves that allowed them lift off of the snow to get to these lichens. And so they would spend the winter in small herds, small groups, just kind of hanging out on these ridge lines, eating these lichens, which you can see here. It's a picture of the lichens that they would feed on. And so there's the historical distribution of caribou. This is all caribou, includes all caribou in North America, but the woodland caribou, which includes the mountain caribou, you can see in the 19th century existed in northern Maine, in northern New Hampshire, northern Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota, and also in Montana, Idaho, and Washington. And in Idaho, their range extended as far south as the Salmon River. And so a quick timeline on the history of caribou in the United States and Idaho. So prior to European settlement, there was estimated to be 800 individuals or 10 to 13% of the total North American population in the lower 48. In 1860 to 1900, there was a sharp decline in caribou populations due to market hunting associated with railroad, timber, and mining industries. In 1913, Idaho banned caribou hunting. And then there's a pretty big gap within which there were people who were doing research on mountain caribou and dwindling populations due to habitat fragmentation from continued and excessive logging and resource extraction, and then climate change, which, in addition to really breaking up their habitat and destroying the old growth forests that they depended on for survival, it also created a large swath of early seral forests, which attracted other ungulates such as deer, elk, and moose, much higher numbers than historically present in this part of the country, which then brought in increased numbers of predators, and all of that contributed to the demise of the mountain caribou over time. So finally, after many years of not a whole lot of attention given to the presence and kind of slow process of extinction of caribou in Idaho, in January of 1983, there was an emergency listing of the South Selkirk caribou as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act. And then there were 3 augmentation efforts in Idaho and 1 in Washington between 1987 and 1998 which brought subpopulation numbers back up to 46 by 2009. And they would go into northern British Columbia and they would capture woodland caribou from Anaheim, British Columbia, and Revelstoke, British Columbia, and they would airlift them in a helicopter down into these holding pens in the Selkirks, and they would do a slow release. They would leave them there in these pens and feed them lichens for a few weeks, and then they'd let them go out and wander. And they were collared caribou, and they'd monitor them, and the hope is that they would connect up with the resident population there, and then hopefully increase the numbers and establish a viable population. But unfortunately, that didn't work for a number of reasons, mostly because the habitat was already fragmented and couldn't support a viable population of caribou. So anyway, much too late, in 2012, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service designated 30,000 acres of the 350,000 acres that caribou actually used in North Idaho, a critical habitat along the Idaho-Washington border where it meets Canada. And then in 2018, the population was estimated at just 3 individuals. And this is the exigence for our project. In I guess it would be the fall of 2019, my friend Jack sent me this article in a text message about the last 3 remaining caribou in Idaho being captured in a helicopter and airlifted out of their home range and brought to a captive breeding program in southern British Columbia. And this event effectively marked the extinction, the extirpation, the local extinction of mountain caribou in Idaho. And so as students in an environmental humanities program, you can imagine we found this to be an interesting topic of discussion, and thought a lot and had many conversations about the significance of a local extinction kind of right there in our backyard. And we wanted to come up with an idea for a project that we could do to explore this phenomenon a little bit deeper and to try to orient ourselves in relation to this animal that has been driven out of its habitat and extirpated for reasons that we are not disconnected from. And so originally we thought that we'd go up into the mountains and try to find traces of the caribou, to track them, to try to find some sheds or scat or some kind of remains and write a narrative about it. And then we came across an article in an environmental humanities seminar that we were in, written by two prominent scholars in the field of extinction studies named Deborah Bird Rose and Tom Van Duren, which presented a conceptual framework for executing the project in the form of a deep map or spatial narrative. And they opened their essay, their article, by talking about the Hawaiian monk seal, which are one of the most endangered marine mammals in the world. And the monk seal, similar to the caribou, depending on the ridge lines, the high ridges, to avoid predators and for their survival, the monk seal depends on a process of hauling out onto the beaches in order to mate, to feed, to rest, to avoid predators. And because of development and more crowding on the beaches, increased populations of people, they're kind of threatened because they don't have the space that they need to perform this act. And there are also cases in which they're brutally beaten by people who obviously don't respect them. And so there are these educational programs in place where people volunteer to go down to the beaches and to teach people about this process of hauling out for the monk seals. And this is an example that Deborah Bird Rose and Tom Van Duren use to describe what they call a lively ethography, which is ultimately what our project is in the form of a deep map. But there's a really profound quote that I'm going to read that was, for us, kind of motivated this project and allowed us to draw some connections between the caribou and the monk seal and use this moment of extirpation, this moment in which the caribou were airlifted from their home range as a point of departure for starting this deep map. So they write, through these grounded acts of care, they're referring to the volunteers helping the monk seal. Through these grounded acts of care, of witnessing and careful storytelling, these volunteers help daily to enact the dream of a flourishing multi-species community on the beaches of Hawaii. Unexpectedly, interestingly, compellingly, a seal arrives. The arrival feels like a message from the deep, a statement of vulnerability brought onto land by those who live in the ocean but also need to haul out. In these times of extinction and extermination, this moment is a fissure, a happening that becomes a recursive attractor that announces that maybe, just maybe, other kinds of communities might still be possible. So our project is, as I said, really a lively ethography, which according to Rose and Doran is a mode of knowing, engaging in storytelling that recognizes the meaningful lives of others, and that in so doing enlivens our capacity to respond to them by singing up their character or ethos, their ethos being their evolving ways of life. And so we call this Storying Extinction responding to the loss of North Idaho mountain caribou, because the project is really a practice of responding to this moment of extirpation and asking, okay, what does it mean to live in this world in the absence of caribou? What is this space now in the absence of caribou, and how are we to negotiate a caribou-less future? So taking the moment of removal as a point of departure, the project recognizes that the extirpation of Idaho's mountain caribou reveals a complex web of ecological, political, cultural, and economic interaction. All of these factors have played a significant role in the lives and deaths of these animals. Beyond a post-mortem analysis of the causes of extinction, the moment calls for an investigation into the ways in which caribou extinction is storied or narrated by local human communities. How is this local extinction negotiated, processed, forgotten, imagined, and storied by the human and more than human communities that were and continue to be entangled with the lives of Idaho caribou? And what can we learn from these relationships and stories that will aid us in navigating a caribou-less future? So those are the driving questions behind this project. And we started in the spring of 2020 by putting out a call for stories in papers around Idaho, asking for people to participate in recording oral histories, people who had encounters with caribou in the wild before they were extirpated, which decided that we would embed on a GIS map layer in the location where the caribou encounter happened. So we put out a call for stories, people reached out via email, and we set up dates to meet with them. We would drive up to wherever they were, record them on camera, and then go back. And basically the summer was collecting data. We collected 28 oral history videos from 15 unique subjects, some of whom were biologists who worked on caribou recovery efforts. In addition to this, we also hiked into the designated critical habitat in the former range of Idaho mountain caribou, and there we hung trail cameras in probably, I guess, 14 locations. We have around 700 trail camera videos and images from their former habitat. And the idea was to attempt to represent the space in the absence of caribou and to collect stories from the current inhabitants that were probably there while caribou were there, but some of them are also new residents, but their presence there, regardless, gestures, which I'll show you in a demonstration of the website, gestures to the lack of caribou being in this space, and that's kind of the idea behind the project. So this is an image from the critical habitat where we placed a few cameras and camped. Another image from, so this is Snowy Top Mountain. This is the site where the last Idaho ranging caribou were actually seen before their extirpation. This is an unnamed lake on the Selkirk Crest that we hung some cameras at. This is one of the ridge lines that you could imagine finding or seeing a caribou in the winter. A really fascinating image that captured us as we were retrieving one of these cameras. After 3 weeks, we had gone up there, we hung the cameras on our first trip into the mountains, and then 3 weeks later we're coming back. And I like this image because it gets at the reflexive component of the deep map, the way in which we're also participating in this thing that we're creating. And we're doing a lot of reflecting on ourselves and our own relationship to the space, and situating ourselves in relation to the caribou and their former habitat. And then we also, this is an image of one of the subjects that we met, Bob Case, who you're going to see a video of in just a second here. We collected all of the data. We collected the images and oral histories We met with biologists, learned about the caribou ecology. This is actually an image. This is a photograph taken from one of the augmentation efforts, from a helicopter landing to capture these caribou in a net and bring them back to Idaho. And so we have it's a little playful, because you're going to something, you're going somewhere expecting to see something that isn't there. And so as part of the deep map is a performative thing. And so this is part of the performance of the deep map, and the playfulness is that we have this fake 404 page that has confused some people. I've heard from many people that the website is broken, but all you have to do is read up here that it says, sorry, no caribou. There's this funky cartoon. We're having trouble finding that species. And then you can click this link, Storying Extinction, responding to the loss of North Idaho's mountain caribou. And it'll bring you to the About page, which tells you all about the project, goes back over the theory that I discussed earlier, and gives you a sense of kind of where we're at. This is ongoing. We're still in the process of development, so it talks a little bit about future development. So the map here includes this GIS layer with these nodes, and if you click on a node, it'll take you way down into the space, and it's kind of confusing, and it's difficult to navigate if you don't spend a lot of time here. So, but you can click into this, into these nodes, and then ultimately view one of these items, and it'll pop up in this screen with the GIS layer in the background, and you can. These are game camera images from one space, and you can navigate through them. You'll see a lot of empty space, and then suddenly maybe the weather will change, or you'll see a white-tailed doe passing through, which I personally love, especially since I spent so much time in the mountains and in the caribou habitat. I love just kind of sitting with this map. You can spend hours going through these images, and it gives you a sense of the space, a deeper sense of the space than you otherwise would get if you were just looking at the critical caribou habitat and thinking about. But the map also includes 2 long-form nonfiction essays, one by myself about our adventures in the mountains and in collecting the data for the project, and then one by my colleague Jack. So mine is titled Mountains because it's about being in the mountains, and Jack's is Valleys because it's focusing more on the collection of these oral histories. And these are also part of the performance of the map. These are also part of representing and enacting the space and kind of orienting ourselves to the existence and non-existence of caribou and what it means for us to be there. And then we've just added this trails feature because we realize that it is not that user-friendly. It can be very overwhelming to arrive at that GIS layer and see thousands of nodes and not really know where to go. And so we've made these curated trails. We have 5 curated trails. And I'll just, to wrap things up, take you through one of these trails, which I think gives you a really good example of the deep map and what it's trying to do in combining the oral histories and the game camera footage. So I'll just jump into that. I think we should have audio.
Caribou are a large 4-legged ungulate, so they're just like deer and elk. which are common across this entire United States, and most of us, that's how we associate. You know, if we see a large animal like that, we're going to think that way. And I think what is really amazing about caribou, what always amazed me, was they're completely unique and completely different from how they exist in their habitat than deer and elk. For one, they're very much a forest creature, and the forest in mountainous country. So that means all of their country, wherever they go, is basically up or down. And so from what we collected on their habitat use and how they move, what it looks like is, to them, this elevational migration is very important, which is no different than deer and elk. And that is commonly seen when winters come. Deer and elk go in low elevation to avoid snow, stay on the area with as little snow as possible to help them save energy through the winter. And the caribou do the exact opposite, because they're caribou. When it snows in November, December, and then probably January or so, when that snow sets up, they go up onto the highest ridges in the Selkirks, up onto those big flat ridges, not pointy ones like you might imagine goats or sheep might be seen in, but more broad, which still have trees on them. And these trees hold lichens, which those caribou eat all winter long. Old man's beard, that kind of thing you see hanging from branches and trees, that's what caribou eat all winter long by standing on 10 to 15 feet of snowpack on the ridge of the Selkirk Mountains in British Columbia and the United States. And so that's probably one of their most distinct characteristics, which is then followed by a down migration in spring, and then for calving females an up migration to isolate again on ridges, and then migration throughout their range during the summertime to take advantage of the forbs and the greens that are available.
I'll end on this oral history.
I'm Bob Case. I took a hike up to Chimney Rock. I'd say it was either 93, maybe up to 95, somewhere in there. And when I went up over this ridge, open rock field, which you can see like right in here, came down, I was walking down, and then this caribou stood up. Well, the people told me about being careful with the encounters with the different animals that could charge you. And I said, well, they never told me about this, what this could do. So I stood there and looked for an area where I could dive under the rocks to protect myself. Got my camera out, started taking pictures. And the caribou got up, and it walked around me just like this. And it got closer and closer as it walked. When it got here, I believe it got the smell of me with the wind blowing, and then it just walked off. So that was my day, that I got to see a caribou, And I've been hiking ever since, because the biggest thrill ever since I've been hiking here.
Yeah, so there's quite a bit more there. I think with our setup here, it's a little bit difficult to get the audio, and there's also, I think it would take a long time to get through all of these videos, but I encourage you, I think the website link was on the press release, so visit Storying Extinction, .onrender.com and take a look at the site and get a better sense of what the project is. There are tons of really fascinating trail cam images and videos and some really compelling oral histories from people who had their lives changed encountering caribou in the wild, and also people who dedicated their lives to seeing caribou and never saw them. People who dedicated their lives to attempting to protect the species, and together, as I mentioned earlier, all of the images and videos and everything in this map is really an attempt to create a sense of the absence of this species. Everything is about caribou, but you never really see a caribou, and it's not so much an attempt to bring caribou back to the South Selkirks. I feel like there are ethical problems with that, considering that they don't actually have the space that they need to live there. But the sense of lack that I think one might experience, or that I hope one would experience while browsing through this website and thinking about this map and experience the space, is one that I think hopefully will inform the ways in which we think about how we engage with space and place in our communities in the future, and think about, one of the things that we're trying to do with this project, inviting people to participate in these oral histories. The project is ongoing and open. We want people to continue to contribute. And in that sense, we're leaving the map open, and we're leaving the space open, and we're trying to extend this space of the extirpated caribou, the absent mountain caribou, into the future, recognizing extinction as a process that we're all a part of, that we've all participated in, whether or not we knew we did. Many of the people we interviewed didn't even know that caribou, before they had the encounter, didn't know that they were there. And many of them who maybe knew that they were there didn't know that they were extirpated. And so asking them to contribute these stories also draws them into the space in a new way, and asks them to consider their orientation as well to this event and what it means to live in a world where we are experiencing mass extinction, and where things like the extirpation of caribou in our backyard is happening much more frequently than we'd like. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. This was great. And thank you, everyone, for coming out.